we're delighted to have Raef Zreik join us, and I will let David introduce him. But I just want to say a word about who we are and why we are doing this. Many of you have joined us 2 Sundays ago at our conference, which was a wonderful show of the size of our growing group. We had over 500 people in the room, about 1,200 on the live stream. I think it also demonstrated the work we are trying and need to do, which is to both hold on to our love and care for our family and friends in Israel, and also to open our hearts to trying to think about how to create a future in which all people, Jews, Palestinians, Israelis, Christians, Muslims, all have freedom and equality and rights. I think we realized at the conference how challenging it is sometimes to hear our own story or the stories we've grown up with from the point of view of Palestinians and how different that story might sound. And this is part of what we're trying to do both as a group and in this course. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to David and Raef.
Thank you, Esther. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. Really delighted to see you all for this third installment of our conversations about Palestine that centers Palestinian intellectuals and thinkers. I'm really delighted to be in conversation today with a friend and colleague, Professor Raef Zreik, who teaches political philosophy and law at Ono Academic College. He's also a senior fellow at the Leer Institute in Jerusalem, which some of you may be familiar with. But what I want to emphasize is that Raef is really one of the most important and trenchant intellectuals thinking about Zionism, the state of Israel, Palestinian identity, the question of Palestine as it manifests today that I know of. And I'm really think it's a great opportunity for the small Emuni US audience to hear from Raef. So welcome, Raef. Great to have you.
Welcome. Thank you, David, for this invitation and for this opportunity to talk to the group, which I think it's very important to have these days. Days of war, but in general.
Yeah, days of war, but in general, I agree. So let's maybe begin at the beginning, Raef, and offer you the opportunity to introduce yourself. Where do you come from? And I know that's a very challenging question for you in some sense, because you are a philosopher and you could answer that in all sorts of ways, in a physical or metaphysical way. But maybe you can just introduce yourself to the audience as you'd like to be understood and heard.
I'm glad that you're asking me where you come from. You didn't ask me where you're heading to.
Yet.
Yeah, that's probably an easier question. I mean, geographically, I'm from Galilee. I was born in Ailabun, north of Nazareth, where I grew up until the age of 17. I was even a very professional volleyball player.
A little known fact about the philosopher.
You know, at one point in my life, I was going to my therapist, and one of the things that we were discussing, why am I not having sense of touch with reality? And at one point, therapists don't speak too much, but at one point he said, I don't exclude the fact that you're spent too much playing volleyball and you think that you can defy the laws of gravity. You were flying too much of your childhood and you think that you can always jump, but in reality, gravity pulls you back to the ground, and that takes time. Yeah, so I grew up there. I wanted as a child, as I remember myself, the age of 10, I having two figures in my head, even without reading one word of what they wrote. And those were Rousseau and Einstein. I was attracted to them as figures. So I wanted pretty much when I studied physics and mathematics at school to study physics and philosophy, actually. Um, but during Sabra and Shatila, I was very active those days, and I was arrested for several days. I was
So you're
interrogated.
talking about September 1982,
Yeah, yeah.
Lebanon War.
And that was pretty much life experience that changed my plans because I thought that what I'm going to do with physics and philosophy, except from teaching, and I was sure that no institution in Israel would accept me to enroll to teaching these topics. So I better find some job that I can at least not make money, but at least I can survive. It's a mode of survival. So I went to the law school at the Hebrew University simply to have a profession. That's why I went to the law school. I remember my years in the law school probably hardly attending my classes. Don't tell anybody. So I wasn't fascinated um, with the law materials. In retrospect, I think law is just a great profession as a matter of thinking, not as a matter of practice. But I always knew that I would leave that and I go back to philosophy. I took some physics classes actually while I was studying law. But you can't do physics as a hobby. Probably philosophy, you can maintain it as a hobby, but physics, that was so difficult. So I recognized early on that one of my dreams I have to give up, and that's physics. But philosophy, I always knew that one day, I didn't know when, I practiced law actually for many years. So I'm really a lawyer. I'm still a lawyer. I still go to court from time to time. I do litigation. And that gives me a sense of anchoring, actually, a sense of the particular, a sense of the importance of details, of the small distinctions. Uh, but the more time passes, and lots of time passed, um, 9 years passed until the idea of that I would continue to my private law firm to open the door in the morning and to meet clients and to go to court was unbearable. To think that I will spend another 35 years doing the same or 40 years, it was just a nightmare. So I left to the US. I went to Columbia first and then to Harvard Law School. I pursued my studies.
So I'm curious about what each of those disciplines, how they spoke to you and activated your mind. I mean, you said you were once dismissive of law but came to appreciate it, and philosophy has always been there. So what parts of your brain do law and philosophy activate? What questions do they pose or answer for you? And how connected are they? I mean, part of what you do is try and bring them into conversation with one another. But I'm interested to hear how you what law does for you and what philosophy does for you.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I should add literature. I mean, I read lots of poetry and literature as well. I feel I'm lucky that some people, for the humanities and the other part of the mind is for mathematics. I enjoy them at the same time. And some people reading my work in philosophy or in law would feel the attempt to be too analytical and too mathematical, while at the same time I'm trying to be as well poetical. So I try to do that even writing about Kant, to trying to be poetical at the same time. I came to study philosophy on my own, actually. I spent 5 years at Harvard, but I wasn't enrolled in philosophy department. I wrote my dissertation at the law school. And my dissertation was on Kant's formalism in general, but more specifically on the distinction between the transitions in Kant, the transitions from um, from metaphysics to ethics, and from ethics to law. But in general, I was working on Kantian formalism. But I studied philosophy from the eyes of a lawyer and from the eyes of political activist. And what does that mean, studying law from these two point of view that are anchored in reality? Is keeping the sense of the tragic sense of our decisions. If you are a lawyer and you do lots of litigation like I did most of the time, you realize the level of radical indeterminacy in your litigation process. You never know how things will end up. You lose cases you are sure that you will win. You win cases you are sure that you will lose. The amount of details that can change the perception is just endless. So, and that's enriched the way I think about philosophy, and the same when I think about the way that my politics enriched my reading of philosophy. Actually, my recent book that I just published 2 years ago, it's Reading of Kant, is pretty much inspired by this nitty-gritty critique of the Kantian scheme, that some philosophers think that if you give the overall principles or the guidelines, then it's all a matter of application. And that was my experience, that it's the matter of application is always creation. And you can't move from general principle to concrete conclusion that easily. And that's also give the advantage to criticize politics as well. Because in politics, most of the time, my experience was that politicians use principle basically to justify ad hoc their position that they have already committed to or taken for several reasons, for egoistic reason, for reason, and whatever you name it. And then all ideas appear on the stage a little bit later on, which made me, to a certain point, suspicious of high-level theory. It's probably you, David, as a historian, you have this same sensitivity that comes with the time, that any attempt to impose a coherent conceptual scheme over history, you experience there's something in the details of history that try to escape this imposition. There's something in the facts that remain recalcitrant against the imposition of conceptual clarity or conceptual coherence, that you learn to be suspicious of theory.
Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting choice of vocation for someone who is suspicious of theory, and conceptual clarity uh, and deterministic views of the world, because we often associate philosophy with exactly those aspirations. I'm so tempted to just continue to talk about Kant and not get to sort of the other topics we had talked about, but I feel I have to ask just one more question about Kant, and I think I have an answer. Um, is what part of your attraction to him, if any, can we attribute to Kant, not just as the sort of pioneer in new understandings of epistemology, of the way we understand the world and cognition, but as a classic representative of the Enlightenment, who for whom the ideal of intellectual and political liberation were in some sense conjoined. But what I'm asking is, was Kant a political hero to you in any way, or not at all? Meaning, we're going to make our way into talking about what Palestinian intellectuals influenced you in your path and your distinctive vision of the intellectual. Is Kant one of those who positively influenced your conception of the intellectual who, as you noted in an article on Said, avoids the excesses of the political ideologue on one hand,
Mm.
and sort of the professional scholar who's sort of consumed by the pedantic, as it were, on the other.
Now, let me tell you an anecdote about how do I get to work on Kant. Um, it was not something planned pretty much to work on Kant. I mean, after my orals, you have these oral exams, and actually, I did my orals in so many separate fields. I took a field in literary theory, a field in the history of political thought, and field in theories of human rights, philosophy of human rights. So those were the fields I didn't know where to go from there. I didn't want to do something about Israeli legal system. So I thought that I didn't come to Harvard just to reproduce my imprisonment to the Israeli legal system. I mean, I should get rid of it, at least while in my studies. I didn't feel confident to do something about the American legal system. Um, and I had a hunch that I want to do some critique of liberalism. And why I want to do a critique of liberalism is in part because part of my experience as a lawyer was there's something in the process that seems to me okay in the Israeli legal system, especially when you take cases, land cases, planning, cases that are related really to the conflict. Most of the cases, I lost them, but it was very difficult to pin down exactly what went wrong in the case. So the inner morality of law was kept, and the process seems to be neat. And still, I had the feeling that there was something missing. And I was obsessed with this idea that how at the same time there was a tilt in the process that most of the time I was losing, while the law at the surface seems to be neutral. And this is a recurrent theme in all of my work, actually, both in my work in philosophy, both in my work in legal theory. It's try to unearth this gap between the appearance of neutrality, the neat surface, and the harsh reality beneath it, and how can we explain it to make sense out of it. So I wanted to critique formalism and liberalism, and it's just Kant came out as the paradigm of of enlightenment, of universalism, of formalism, of humanism. And I started to read Kant from scratch. So it just took me almost a year and a half um, on my own. I attended classes of Kierkegaard and Scanlon. I mean, these are great scholars. It's not just but I spent a year and a half just reading Kant without knowing where the dissertation would be heading. Absolutely not. It's just a year and a half just reading in order to come with a question. So that was. Now, I think in retrospect, Kant did influence my thinking, definitely. Kant influenced my thinking. I know where Kant influenced my thinking. I do know. I can recognize what is the kind of Kantian sensibility that has influence on me. Yeah.
So, the critique of liberalism that you took on as your project is a project that has ramifications for liberalism in many different parts of the world and certainly in the West. What is the distinctive angle that you may bring to that question through your lenses as a Palestinian? To what extent is that a question of Palestine, right? The critique of liberalism. What are the distinct variations of that critique that relate to the Israeli case or to Zionism, and that are not just sort of generic critiques of liberalism that many great philosophers, yourself included, have taken on?
Yeah, definitely. The critique of liberalism is as old as liberalism itself. I mean, the moment that Kant was writing, Herder was writing, and when Mill was writing, there were counter-enlightenment and romantic trends in Europe. Mazzini was writing when Mill was writing. So there's nothing new in uh, in some sense with me coming to critique liberalism, but I came to critique it, to this critique, not as a theoretical agenda, but I came with a certain pain. I came with a certain question pressing on me. I didn't write a dissertation because I thought, okay, what the options do I have to write a dissertation? I came with a specific question, and as we know, any good the paper is a paper that's trying to answer a good question. So I came with a question. And last year, for the anniversary to 300 years of the anniversary of Kant anniversary, he was born in 1724, a very famous Kantian um, held Susan Nyman, I guess, I believe, you know, the head of the Einstein Forum. She wrote several books on Kant, and she held this conference 300 years to Kant and Enlightenment. And probably there, this is a forthcoming paper. I was trying to think, look, there's something going on, especially these days. Let's call them after Gaza. Though Gaza, the after didn't arrive yet. Uh, this is a theme that's been going on for last 20, 30 years, post Edward Said, post Orientalism. Orientalism started in literary theory, then it migrated to politics, etc. Recently, it reached philosophy. That philosophy, the European philosophy, is a mode of sort of subjugating, dominating the rest of the world, mainly Asia and Africa. It's another mode of colonialism. And I was always wondering, to make this question, problematize this question, what does it mean that Kantian philosophy, or the philosophy of enlightenment, now Habermas has passed away and there's lots of writing on that. So some wrote that the philosophy of enlightenment is actually a continuation of colonization, or it allows colonization, or it justifies colonization. I have sympathy for that, but that seems to me a little bit hasty conclusion, because what does it mean to say that Kantian demand to treat people as ends, not mere means, or the equality of men is something that justify colonialism? So there was something still missing in that link. Uh, it's true that people like John Locke were preaching liberty and having slaves. John Stuart Mill preaching liberty and holding shares in all kind of colonial enterprises. But one can say that this is mismatch between the man and his ideas. But if we think about the ideas, in what sense? Now you can find in David Hume, you can find in Kant all kind of passages where they really say something really racist. But again, one can say that there is something in the theory itself that's different from their personal statements. So there's difference between judging Kant and judging Kantianism,
Mhm.
or judging enlightenment and judging the main figures of enlightenment. So I was thinking, in what sense enlightenment in itself is a project of divination? Um, and that the answer is very long answer, actually. The answer is very long answer, but let me try to make the long answer short. And the short answer for the long story is the following. And here is the lawyers in me, if you want. And the lawyers in me says that those who think that there's a contradiction between Habermas' ideal speech situation or communicative action and his position in Israel, that there is a contradiction, are mistaken. Those who think that Kant's position on slavery is contradict his position in his moral theory are mistaken. I don't subscribe to the contradiction thesis. What do I mean by that? I mean by that there's a level, and here's the mistrust of theory. The theory could be so many things at the same time that usually it could allow justification for so many things that it's difficult to speak about any contradiction. So the theory can allow itself at the same time to look nice, while at the moment of implementation to do severely evil things without even making that a contradiction. But how to prove that, that's a long story.
Mhm. Okay.
Which leaves me with the question that you put, then what is the value of theory? It's a
Okay.
good
Well,
question.
I want to get to that, but maybe I want to just fill out the picture a little bit, going back to the critique of liberalism, because you said that what you bring to that is a question and pain, which I think are relating to um, your the lenses through which you view the world, which are in no small part Palestinian. And I want to sort of try and engage in alternative genealogy to your formation. You talked about, being drawn to Rousseau and Einstein as a 10-year-old, and we've spoken a lot about Kant. But you've also been engrossed in conversation with leading Palestinian and Arab intellectuals, whom we want to talk about. I'm going to put three on the table, and we're going to talk about all of them in our remaining time, and try and understand what they've given to you and what you think their significance is for the project of Palestinian liberation. And they are Edward Said, the Palestinian-American literary scholar and critic, intellectual, Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestine-born poet, and Elias Khoury, the Lebanese novelist of the Nakba. Three towering figures, three people whose work you know intimately. And I just want to sort of get a sense of what imprint they left upon you. How did they, and other, for that matter, other Palestinian intellectuals, form you as well, along with the Western intellectuals whom you've mentioned? So let's just begin with one of them, and maybe Darwish, who in some sense, maybe biographically most close to you.
Um, I'm I really feel lucky that I knew the three of them. Um, I can't say I was a friend of the three of them. I was a close friend, very close friend to Elias Khoury, despite the uh, age difference between us. But the last 20 years, we were very close friends. We spoke almost on weekly basis, exchange ideas. He was the editor of Journal of Palestine Studies. He recruited me to write almost every issue of and so he was the first reader of the drafts of my essays. And from time to time, we spoke about his novels. But I think who influenced me the most was Mahmoud Darwish. And first of all, he was the first that I've read. And Mahmoud Darwish, I don't exaggerate, but in Latin, disaster is this star is when you have no star to give you a sense of orientation. And in that sense, Mahmoud was a star, not a glamorous star
Your
or
Northern Star.
superstar. Yeah, in his ability to turn our subconscious feeling into vocabulary through which we can express in very intensive manner not only our ideas, but the depth of our ideas combined with a very existential sense of being. So Darwish has this ability to encapsulate in just one sentence something that you have to formulate in pages.
A philosopher would take several pages to capture the sentiment that a poet can concisely
Definitely,
and eloquently summarize in a
definitely.
sentence, in a sense. Yeah.
And he was pretty much a philosopher. And even now, I've studied so many years. I read lots of philosophy, analytical philosophy, Hegel and Sartre and Kierkegaard and Heidegger. And so many times while I'm reading Darwish, I still feel him ahead of me in the sense that he captures something in reality and he can put it in just few words and can express the ideas also in images in a way that can make a very long story short. Um, so in that sense, Darwish was the first one to read, and I feel also that my Arabic language in itself is indebted to Mahmoud Darwish. So I
So,
find
oh,
even when I write about Darwish, I find myself guilty of borrowing his own vocabulary to describe him. So in that sense, Darwish captured very deeply the Palestinian question and the Palestinian wound.
yeah.
I put it, not the Palestinian question. Now, uh,
Can we just stop there for a minute and maybe
mhm.
focus in particular on a core concept, certainly for Said as well, and we'll get to Said, but a core concept really anchoring Darwish's worldview, which is the idea of exile. I wonder if you could offer some Rashi, as it were, on Darwish's notion of exile.
It's difficult to speak about Darwish without Said on exile. So probably to put the two together can explain something. Um, Said exile is just the key word in all of his thinking. Said, you understand Said through the concept of exile. Exile as the moment of, I wouldn't say this overcoming of intimacy in the bad sense of intimacy, the killing, the killing intimacy, the politics of identity, this feeling, this homeness that can be suffocating, this homeness that is obsessed that everything stranger everything foreign is a kind of adultery. So Said thinks that being in exile is the most reflective to the human existence because we are all, in some sense, in exile. And there are certain ethics of exile because in exile we meet each other basically as equal person. It is the paradigm of the public sphere, if you want, of the Habermasian public sphere, because if you meet me at my home or I meet you at your home, we are already positions in a different way. You allow yourself to do things at home that you don't allow yourself if you're in exile. This sense of homeness that most people think very positively about. Said took to be that there's a sense to feel too much home, and the world allows you to do things that emanate from a certain sense of entitlement that you deserve to do because this place belongs to me, which by definition might lead you to disregard others, the rights of others. In that sense, homeness is owning, is exclusivity, and it's you're already on the path to violence. Exile is disowning. And Said was very proud that he didn't own an apartment. He lived all of his life without owning an apartment. So there's the ethics of disposition. To see the world from the point of view of the dispossessed, the refugee, the man standing at the door, from the prosodors, from the sidewalk, not from the inside, but from the outside, from the one who's standing on the border.
There are two ironies here that are worth pointing out. One, this sounds very Jewish. And two, perhaps the leading advocate in the world of the call for Palestinian liberation, including the right of return, was
Yeah,
the great theoretician of exile, sort of the
definitely.
place of moral comportment. So, I mean, Said, as we know, called himself the last Jewish intellectual. So he very much associated himself with that exilic tradition. But there is that, though, there are those that pair of ironies to note.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. Um, and one can easily misunderstand this sensibility of exile in Said to be some kind of preaching for people to leave their home or to leave their country or against the ideas of homelands. This is a sensibility that you, because he himself said there's nothing more painful than to live that one should be uprooted from his homeland. So it's not singing the praise of being uprooted. That would be a mistake to understand Said in that way. But the idea is that you should always take the position of the dispossessed. It's a way of intuiting the universe. It's a way to approach ethics. And that completely he's following Benjamin and more Adorno in that sense. Uh,
Do you, I'm wondering, I mean, it's kind of obvious question, but do you feel a particular um, sense of that exilic stance from your subject position as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, sort of at once in the homeland and yet dispossessed, kind of the constant tension between physical rootedness, as it were, and a constant sense of political uprootedness on the other.
you're absolutely right. Um, I mean, one is afraid to sound uh, very poetical or very metaphorical. But I do feel a sense of hominess. In the very literal sense, there are places in my village where I go there, in the physical sense, that really are able to lower my blood pressure. Literally. Certain bustan where are certain olive trees and other trees that the family grow there. And I really feel that sense of hominess in that sense, that primordial intimacy. At the same time, I do experience the fragility of my existence. It's like a worker who like his work, but at the same time, he could be fired at any minute. I mean, the feeling at the second Intifada, I was living in New York, I did have this obsession of 1948 that the borders might be shut down at any minute and I might be another refugee like the rest of the Palestinians. So, in that sense, I entertain, if that's the right word, I imagine this positionality, how one can be at the edge, living at the edge. And I do share the sensibility in that sense of the fear of too much sense of entitlement is a dangerous thing. Not only in the personal, the political, in every possible sense, there is a danger in the sense of entitlement, of owning, of exclusivity. And there is something poetical in being a minority sometime, I must say.
I
Which
don't know if
is,
you're familiar with the historian Yuri Slezkin's book called The Jewish Century, in which he posits two typologies of modern beings. There are Mercurians who are fleet and cross borders and speak many languages and, like Said, own no home, which Slezkin identifies with sort of the classic modern Jew. And there are Apollonians who are rooted to the land, speak one language, move very little, and sort of dwell in that space their entire
yeah.
lives. And he makes the point towards the end of his book, the latter half of the book, that the Mercurian has become the Apollonian. The Zionist project has transformed the
Mhm.
fleet cosmopolitan into a landed, rooted person. I wonder if you share that diagnosis of Zionism. And as someone who understands this tradition of exilic thinking, is rooted in Walter Benjamin and other prominent Jewish intellectuals, is this is part of, is there a tragedy there as well?
Look, I think home is important. Let us not be misunderstood. I think home as a place that allows you to fall, stumble, and stand up, that allows you to make mistake and not to be judged by your mistake. A place that allows you space uh, to make mistakes without those mistakes, without you being reduced to your actions. There is a residue of you that is not reduced to what you do. In the sense, there is a certain acceptability of your being that you do not need to fill forms, to make certain achievement, to pass certain exams. And I think that sense is important for people. This familiarity is important for people. Uh, so the idea of home, it's like many other ideas in itself is not a sin. Uh, But like many other things, the idea of community is not a sin, but there is a point when you lose any critical distance from community and your nationalism means that you disregard the rights of other nations. And when your obsession of your home forbids you from any feeling of solidarity with other homeless people, that's the point where it starts to be problematic. Uh, so the issue is the exclusivity, the violence that comes with this sense of entitlement. Now, probably the difference between you started with Mahmoud Darwish about home and exile, and in one of Darwish books, he says, exile is a word that we learn too late in our life. It's too poetical, it's too philosophical. The first thing that came to our mind, um, the vocabulary that occupied our imagination was laji, refugee, to be a refugee. And the refugeness, this feeling of being a refugee, is immediate material being before you reflect on it as an exile. And he tells the story when he went to Lebanon at the age of 6, which was a formative year, I think, in all of his life. He was at the age of 7 when his family was expelled to Lebanon in 1948. He spent 1 year there and he came back, sort of. And in one of my papers, I argue that he never came back from Lebanon because that image of the refugee living with the refugees will occupy him when he is back to Galilee. And when he leaves in 30 years after, or 25 years after, in the early 70s, to join the PLO, he doesn't really leave because part of his heart remains in Galilee. And when he comes back 20 years after Oslo, he doesn't really come back because there's something in the here and there remains, and his heart and his identity is split between here and there, which makes him say in one of his poems, in every home there is an exile, and in every exile, in Arabic the word home, beit, there's a verse of poetry or a home of poetry. So Darwish was more complicated than he was late, a little bit hesitant in his singing the praises of exile. But he did sing the praise of exile. But in one of his books, the last sentence, he would say that I would sing the praise of exile. I will talk to exile and I will tell exile, I will sing your praise when you deserve singing your praise. And that is when I am back at my home under the tree in our garden as a passerby in the passing autumn. So it's very dialectical idea that I can praise exile when, as a Palestinian, my exile is over. As he once said about the Palestinian flag, I would like to have a Palestinian state and a Palestinian flag in order that I can use it to clean my table. But I need the flag first and then I can negate it. And I need Palestine to have a Palestinian state so I can immigrate. And for him, the idea, he once wrote about traveling and he said, you don't travel unless you have a place to return to that is different qualitatively from all other places. That is travel. But if you have no place that qualitatively different from other places, you're just a wandering person that never can travel because he never can go back. The going backness, this going back that infuses traveling with meaning. So in that sense, he was a little bit more Hegelian in that sense. He saw the interdependency between home and exile as each of them is constitutive of the other. Said, the exile played more important role in his philosophy, in his way of thinking, in his role of the intellectual. Because the intellectual is the one positioned in exile. He takes distance from home. He takes distance from the nation. He takes distance from the projects and allow himself to do the critique. And because he viewed himself basically as a critic that actually shatters the consensus, he thought of exile as the mode of being that he wants to adopt. Darwish, who joined the PLO early on, he thought of himself not only as questioning the consensus, but more as actually establishing the vocabulary through which the Palestinian can find himself, can express his pain. And that's different positioning, actually, made both of them use the idea of exile a little bit differently.
Mhm. I want to add to the picture in just a minute, Elias Khoury, the great author and friend of yours. But in light of what you just talked about, the dynamic between exile and home, I want to kind of return to a question that was embedded in sort of a last round of conversation, um, and think about Zionism itself. And because so much of what you described was a similar conversation to that between amongst Jewish intellectuals in the first third of the 20th century about diaspora versus homeland, and indeed in some Zionists themselves, this eternal Hegelian tension or dialectic that you described was very much at work. But my question is really, how do you see Zionism? Do you see it through the lens of the critique of liberalism that you ended up writing your dissertation on? Do you see it through the lens of settler colonialism? Do you see it through the Benjaminian valorization of exile? Do you see it through the lens of the history of nationalist movements, which typically do what they do, which is begin with sort of grand revolutionary ideals and become exclusionary the minute they hit the ground? So, what is the lens through which you observe Zionism, especially thinking of the conversation we just had about homeland and exile?
Uh, Excellent. Really excellent question because it allows me to say many things about Zionism. And I really want to put the issue of homeland and exile. Because for Palestinians, homeland is a generalization of their personal home. So the concrete home with the exact tree comes first to their mind and their imagination. Homeland is accumulation of homes. In Zionism, the homeland comes before the private home. The private home is sort of the particularization of homeland. And this difference makes a difference. This difference makes a difference. Not all differences matter. This difference matter because in Zionism, Palestine is first of all a map and then it's a reality. For the Palestinians, it's a reality and then it's a map. I'm speaking about Zionism, let's say, at its initial stage. Now, you mentioned um, three, four characterization of Zionism, and I subscribe to all of them. Definitely. Zionism is a critique of liberalism, and Zionism is nationalism, and it's probably one of its bad organic primordial senses, and it's a manifestation of settler colonialism. The tools are settler colonial, and it's a manifestation of scientific revolution that accompanied the Enlightenment at the same time. So it's all of them at the same time. And I use Zionism from time to time as a scandal to modernity, as a scandal to the European project itself. So instead of doing very difficult work to critique Europe, the European intellectual history, I can take Zionism ready-made for me in order to do that critique, because there is something in European history that you have to unearth it, to unravel it, in order to show some of its contradictions. But in the case of Zionism, it's all up in the surface. So many people probably forgot what the Belgians did in Congo, or how the America was established on the ruins and on the dead bodies of the American Indians or Native Americans, etc., etc., etc. In the case of Zionism, all of this is going on here and now. And Zionism, probably, for me as a philosopher of law, for example, is just fantastic example, just fantastic. This is the way I end my book, actually, on Kant, is on Israel-Palestine. The last page is on Israel-Palestine. One of the things probably that Agamben popularized 25 years, he's borrowing pretty much Carl Schmitt. I mean, there's not too much beyond Schmitt. But he wrote the book in the right time, post September 11, Guantanamo, which means that the total suspension of constitutional law. Now, what's the importance of Guantanamo? And what's the importance of Schmitt? And why Israel is important? Because Guantanamo is the suspension of the norm. And we think that the norm usually prevails, but from time to time, there's a suspension in a case of emergency. In certain places. But the exception is kept at the corner. The rule of law prevails. Now came Guantanamo, and we saw that actually the exception can devour all of the system, and you don't know actually where the exception might end. And now you live in America in days where you don't know the exception. You don't know if the fact that you holding an American passport that is give you total defense or constitutional rights. The fact that you have a green card doesn't mean that you can't expelled of the country or not. And I think Israel, in that sense, is the paradigm of the permanent state of emergency, of the fact that norm and exception constitute each other. It's not that there's no difference between norm and exception, or that the whole world is exception. No, the idea here is that I simply don't have a norm that can tell me how to distinguish between the norm and the exception. In that sense, the exception is like in Marx's term, is the infrastructure, and the rule is the superstructure, and the exception can all the time take over the norm. Now, if
Okay.
you look at
I want to pause here and just try and translate so that we all understand. I'll do that by asking a question, but you're summoning up the legacy of the conservative and Nazi-aligned German political theorist Carl Schmitt and his notion that the modern notion of the sovereign is very much dependent on the ability to declare a state of emergency, and that becomes the state of the sovereign. Are you saying that Zionism in this regard is characteristic of that modern sovereign power? Or is it an exceptional case? I mean, playing off of the very criterion of norm versus exception. Is it an extraordinary case or the characteristic case?
Oh, yeah, this is look, in the European history, the idea of the exception and the idea of normativity has always been there. And that was originally a theological debate, because if God is almighty and he's absolutely sovereign, then whenever he legislates, he shouldn't be and he couldn't be restrained by a norm that existed before God. And that's a tradition that goes back to Pufendorf and Grotius. Grotius is an intellectualist. Pufendorf says, no, there must be at the end, at the top, some will that imposes itself. So this tradition, as intellectual tradition, has always been there. At certain points, it's the intellectualist prevail, historically and politically. So after the Second World War, there's a rise of constitutionalism. Hans Kelsen wins over Carl Schmitt. You have constitutions, you have rule of law, and all is working. But be careful. At the same time, in the 19th century, when in England there was a rule of law, there were always areas that you can say that we can suspend the rule of law. In Ireland, we can suspend the rule of law. In India, we can suspend the rule of law. So the idea of the suspension of the rule of law and making exception, either geographically, there are certain places outside the country that the rule of law doesn't prevail, or inside the country because there are certain enemies that they are not actually citizens, we can put them outside the norm. This is part of the European tradition as well. Absolutely. So Zionism didn't invent the theory of the exception. Absolutely not. But because Israel is by definition trying to create a majority amongst Palestinians where there used to be a majority, then everything could be viewed in terms of emergency. When Israel says we are in emergency, that's not a total lie. And when Israel, they say we are in self-defense, that's not a total lie. There's some truth in that. I'm not saying that to justify what Israel is doing, but probably this says that what in Europe from time to time emerges on the surface, probably in the 19th century, probably in the colony, but in Israel, the colony is 5 minutes from the capital of Israel. The exception is 5 minutes from the capital of Israel. So the moment of exception is prolonged forever in Israel. And in that sense, Israel is a laboratory to revise the whole idea of legality in modern thinking. It simply allows you to see, if I want to go to other country, to go to dig in the archives. In Israel, I don't need to dig in the archives. Now, I don't say this to defend Israel or to justify what it's doing. Of course, nobody can think that I'm going that way, but just to show that there is a history of this idea, and probably one should judge a project that is unable to normalize itself. Now, Israel is saying, oh, okay, after Iran, we should think of Turkey because Turkey is probably another threat. There's no end to this project. This project cannot reach a norm. In that sense, Israel is one sort of a nationalism. It's Eastern European organic biological nationalism. It's settler colonial at the same time. And it has an emancipatory impulse in it. Yes, it has. If you read the Pinsker before 150 years writing about auto-emancipation, it has emancipatory impulse. But, and this is a great but, there's something in Zionism that was from the start, from moment, even at best emancipatory moments, a distrust of humanism. a distrust in the human race, a distrust in equality and the promises of enlightenment. Zionism, Zionism is probably the most eloquent charge against Immanuel Kant and the process of enlightenment. When you
Where do you
read
see
it,
that? Where do you see that? Right.
you see that in Herzl in the Jew state. He said, even humanity is even a dangerous dream.
Mhm.
We should trust the idea of humanity. You read that in Pinsker. I'm giving you not the fundamentalist religious right wing.
Yeah.
What is considered basically sort of as I see that in Borokhov. I
Yeah.
see that in the socialist tradition as well.
Right. So even going back to the beginning, to Pinsker, 1884, auto-emancipation, Jews are everywhere strangers, Judeophobia is afflicts the humanity at large. This and I mean, what it suggests is that there is this very deep pain and trauma that attends the Jewish condition that leads to the Zionist solution, which, in some sense, reminds me of the pain that you described when you come to the critique of liberalism through your own experience as a Palestinian. In other words, there's something, again, to return to a motif in our conversation, so evocative about that distrust of humanity or the pain that is felt. Exile is a wonderful place to be, right? Except when it isn't, which is a lot of the time. It brings with it massive discomfort and often oppression and marginalization. And I wonder if one can identify these parallels between that pain that Pinsker gave voice to, that Herzl gave voice, that sense of offense, that sense that we will never be at home in Europe, and the question of Palestine.
You can, I absolutely identify with that pain, but I disagree with you to make the comparison in the sense that in the Palestinian intelligentsia, if you read Edward Said, you wouldn't find distrust in humanism. Actually, his last book, he was too humanist to my taste. You don't find that in Elias Khoury. You don't find that in Mahmoud Darwish. No, you don't find that. Now, of course, the history of the Palestinian, it's probably different from the history, the Jewish history in Europe. But I mentioned that because this thing of distrust of humanity is something that even if there were emancipatory impulses in Zionism, there was something prone in the project that might lead to what we're seeing now. Now, I'm not a determinist. It might lead, it might not. But the seeds are there. So let's say the fact that it led where it led is not a total surprise. Let me put it in that modest way. It's not a total surprise. It could have ended other way. There were sort of all kind of crossroad in history that that my sense of the political, that people can do politics and change the course of history if there are enough powers to do that. But the fact that we got where we got um, could be in part explained by this distrust in humanity that you hear it now in with every minister in Israel, with every politician. You mention international law, and they tell you we don't trust international law. We don't trust organs. We're just being hated because we are Jew, and
Mhm.
this is dangerous because that look the idea of envy that people hate us because we are successful, because we're having money, means that you stop thinking in critical terms about what you're doing because people hate you anyway. So why I should rethink what I'm doing? It's like self-distancing from your action.
Mhm.
It's that people hate me because of what I am, not because of what I do. And this is sort of creating a total barrier or a wall between you and your action.
Okay, we have a terrific question that I want to get to at the end, but we haven't really spoken about Elias Khoury, and I want to just
Yes.
ask make an observation about Khoury for sure, and Said and Darwish. One of the features of those three that I find most remarkable, and each of them possesses it in a significant amount, is a profound appreciation of the Jewish condition, of the condition of Jewish suffering and of that condition as a factor in the victimization and oppression of Palestinians. So famously, in that essay that we read for this class on the one-state solution, Said refers to Palestinians as victims of victims. So there's this realization on the part of these intellectuals, these Palestinian Arab intellectuals, that Jews were victims. Something that, in some sense, because of the course of history, is very hard to see today. Much, much harder to see today. That idea is central to Khoury, to his classic novel of the Nakba, Gate of the Sun, to his trilogy, Children of the Ghetto, where he sort of constantly is playing back and forth between through the lead character, Adam, between the ghetto of Lid or Lod and the Warsaw Ghetto, and Adam kind of passes as a survivor of both in this fantastical play, literary play. But I find this one of the most, in some sense, remarkable and ethical and humanizing and humanistic impulses of that generation of Palestinian and Arab intellectuals to have the capacity to understand the Jew as a victim and then to understand the subsequent course of history by which the Holocaust and its consciousness come to play a role in the creation of the Nakba. I wonder what your thoughts about that is. For me, it's just a kind of astounding feature of that generation of Palestinian Arab intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much remarkable, I must say. Remarkable in several ways. It's remarkable compared relatively that I'm not sure that we have a parallel humanization on the part in the Jewish literature for the Palestinian.
Yeah.
I'm not expert on that, but I can rely on other experts who notice this. So that's one.
Yeah.
In that sense, it is remarkable. And it is relatively remarkable, probably compared to the current mood of intellectuals that came after them.
Yeah.
Take Ghassan Kanafani, for example, عائد إلى Haifa, returning to Haifa. He puts the hero is a soldier uh,
Dov.
with parents from the Holocaust, and he adopted, and he asked the question. It's not a matter of biology. It's very human story that he's telling, and he moves the debate to the political. He says, "Our fight, we have to fight, but the fight is political." But I can't imagine now um, a novel of that courage actually taking place, and still he's holding a prominent role in the Popular Front. So that's
And
remarkable.
we
On
should
the
talk, and his end comes as the result of an Israeli
sorry,
assassination. Yeah. His
yeah.
end, his demise.
So that's pretty much remarkable for a people who were just deported from their land. Their land was stolen, their villages demolished, they are refugees and still are able to bring themselves to such a conversation. Um, Now, Said is an easy case. He's a person of America. He educated in America. He's Upper West Side. He's surrounded by Jewish intellectuals. He knows the narrative inside out. But for Khoury and Darwish, it's more interesting and pressing question. And here I can only have guesses. I think one of them. I mean, look, all the three are completely secular, so um, they're coming from secular tradition. Khoury, there's a question. If you want, we can expand a little bit on that. I think Khoury is the most religious atheist that I know. He is a combination of really of atheist believer, a combination that he's filled with a certain deep belief in justice that you cannot understand it without certain resort to his Christianity. I mean,
It's a
but
pretty large church, I think.
sorry,
I think it's a pretty large church. We underestimate its size, that church.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Mahmoud Darwish, I think the dominance of the communists in Palestine, and Darwish was part of the communists. Now, one thing about the communist Palestinians, uh, the Communist Party made the Palestinians intellectuals sort of connected with the rest of the world early on, relatively, without falling into over nativism. Being aware of the international sort of liberation movement around the world and articulating their political demand in universal terms, part of a more global. Um, uh, uh, so you read in Al Jadid that Mahmoud Darwish used to edit as a 25 years old boy. Um, Translation of whoever you want, from Nazim Hikmat to Lorca to Pablo Neruda to Mayakovsky. So there was something about we are the victims, but we're not the only victims around the world. So I think that also has its impact, but it's definitely remarkable that most Palestinian intellectual didn't replicate the sort of the Zionist closure of mind in regard of the other. They remained open in this sense. I'm not
Yeah.
sure this will continue, by the way. I mean,
No, I don't.
after Gaza, I'm not
Yep.
sure this can continue.
Or can, yeah. Okay, we have just a little bit of time left, and I want to reserve the last word for Greg, one of our members of the audience, who asked us a really interesting question. And I'll read it. Are you familiar with Omri Boehm's recent book, Radical Universalism? So not the Haifa Republic, Radical Universalism Beyond Identity, which relies heavily on Kant and is, in a sense, an attempt to resurrect Kantian universalism and humanism as the only possible grounding of justice and a needed defense against the nihilism that emerges in the absence of universal absolutes. So, can you comment on this thesis of another philosopher from a similar point of origin, Omri Boehm?
Yeah, I know Omri. We're very good friends, I must say. I must say, I hope he's not listening, but I haven't read the book. But we were discussing the book uh, while he was writing the book. And he is his understanding of universalism differs from my understanding of universalism, and his belief in enlightenment and in Kant goes beyond my universalism. I think universalism as something that is always mediated, in the sense it's a kind of a particular that, due to certain circumstances, certain efforts, certain intellectual work, came to be universal, and we assign to it universalism. Apart from mathematics, this is one of the things that I raise following the works of others. For example, in Palestine, Israel, and I bring this to show how the Kantian project can collapse. For Palestinians, to be universal is to stand with the colonizers against the colonized. That's the paradigm of what does it mean to be universal. For most Zionists and most Jews, probably, the paradigm is actually to adapt the memory of the Holocaust. And so anti-Semitism, the fight of anti-Semitism, is the paradigm of the universal. So you have competing universals. What do you do when you have competing universals? And I think this things that Omri doesn't want to challenge or to push. The idea that all people were against apartheid. I mean, I meet people all of my life that when they think, oh, apartheid, there were those evil people who supported apartheid. There were those evil people that could support slavery. There were those evil people that they were not feminist. Relax, guys. When you are in the situation, it moral orientation is far more difficult than you imagine. And so is now in Israel, Palestine. Probably, one day we would look back and people would say, how the people of Israel couldn't recognize that they're committing an awful, destructive genocide against the Palestinian. Probably they come to recognize it, but probably not. And that is a matter of political struggle about what to constitute the universal, the moment of consensus that we all agree upon. So the universal is always in the process of emerging, and it's a project of struggle and fight, not fight of arms, in part fight of power, but intellectual and moral fight. So is the fight against apartheid. Now, I don't claim that Kant is not useful. Kant is useful as a strategy of shattering the closed way of thinking, because the idea of reciprocity allows us always to produce a new argument in asking the other to situate himself in a new position and to reflect afresh on his position. But that doesn't guarantee much, but it opens the conversation.
So, consistent with being the good philosopher that you are, you've left us with a very big question, which is how do we mediate between competing universalisms? I think we're not going to have time to answer that question today, but I'm sure we'll pick up on it when we next see each other. I do want to take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Raef Zreik, for incredibly stimulating and rich conversation. It's really been a delight to be in conversation with you, and I thank you for making time out of your schedule to join with the small Emuni US community and share your profound thoughts. It's really been really a joy. I'm going to hand things over to Esther to close us out.
So I also want to add my deep gratitude and thanks as a American who's a little exiled when I'm in Israel, and an Israeli who's a little exiled when I'm in America. And I think there's something very profound about recognizing how much we share emotionally and historically and psychologically. I want to just remind everyone else on this call a few things. We had sent out earlier, or late last week, an email about a trip we're doing to Israel. It will be in October. I think it's going to be really exciting. Take a look and see if you're interested, sign up. We also would love to ask you all to look in your inbox for the survey that we sent for the conference. It's really helpful for us to see what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, what you'd like us to do in the future. And last, I would like to just remind that our next class in the series, the fourth, will be on after Pesach, Sunday, April 19th, with Dr. Yasmin Abu Farha. Some of you have heard her in an event we had in New York. Others have heard her at our first conference, and I'm confident it's going to be very, very interesting. Pesach kasher v'sameach to everyone, and to be continued. Thank you all.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Esther, for
Thank
this
you, Raef.
opportunity.
Really appreciate it.